examples. Bill, a very good evening to you. 4 of the 7 suicide attackers on 13 June, they attacked at Baji. What is Baji? What's the significance in Iraq? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Yes, Baji is a central city. It's where the Iraq's largest petroleum refinery is located. It refines more than half of, or it used to refine more than half of Iraq's petroleum products until the Islamic State took over about 80% of it. The city itself is contested between the Islamic State and the Iraqi military and supporting Shia militias. Really, the Iraqi military is supporting the Shia militias. So Baiji, it's key. Before the Iraqi military and the Shia militias could even think about moving on Mosul in the north, it has to take Baiji. Baiji sits on the main road between the Baghdad and Samarra and Tikrit up through to Mosul. So again, it has to be taken. The Islamic State is fighting fiercely for it. The refinery itself has just been destroyed. It's inoperable. It won't be able to be repaired for years, if ever. Heavy fighting within the refinery. So the Islamic State it's fighting viciously there, and it's using its probably one of its most potent weapons, which is that suicide assault. We've seen this used by groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the movement of Taliban in Pakistan and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Other groups have used it, but the Islamic State seems to take it to another level. They're putting in anywhere from 5 to 10 suicide bombers in a package, and launching them simultaneously. Al-Qaeda in Iraq never really did it with this level of ferocity, and it's really demoralizing.
So they're loading up these SUVs, they're Toyota Tauruses. They're loading them up with high explosives. They're all black. The men are dressed, and they're smiling at us in their suicide pictures. And they're launching them against the Iraqi army, which says demoralized. At the same time, they're using social media to boast about their wide-scale recruiting. You list Dagestan, Kuwait, Palestine, a Uyghur, an English citizen, and a German citizen. They're choosing one of each. Is this the cannon fodder you've written about, Bill?
Yeah, and this is of a piece. The Islamic State has been publicizing that the majority of its suicide bombers are foreigners or outsiders, or what they call the mujahirin, the immigrants. So it likes to publicize this. It's good for business for the Islamic State. It's good for the recruiting. They get to show the world and their rival Al-Qaeda that they too are able to attract not just Iraqis and Syrians to fight, but foreigners to fight for their cause. And there's no better way to publicize that you have foreigners in your ranks than to use them as suicide bombers. And clearly they have more than enough foreigners volunteering, because the vast majority of these suicide attacks, I'm going to just offhand guess somewhere around 60 to 70% of the suicide bombers that the Islamic State uses, of the reports that I'm seeing come across, are foreigners. It's
appalling, Bill, to consider that these young men destroyed themselves. It's appalling. I know they're supposed to be the enemy, but it's discontinuous with my understanding of warfighting.
Yeah, they've convinced a segment of the Muslim world that blowing yourself up just by ramming a car or an armored Humvee or armored personnel vehicle into an outpost, that's the way to go, and that's your path. I think it speaks to the strength of their ideology and the strength of their preaching.
I know, it's just sad, Bill. You understand? Dead young men. Dead young men. They're just well. All right, let's move to more dead young people, because this is the fighting. Bill is talking about fighting in the Iraq Civil War. Now we go to the Syrian Civil War. Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation joins me now, because there is an ongoing controversy. It's important, because this has to do with the claims by Al-Qaeda, represented by the al-Nusra Front in Syria, and the claims by the Islamic State about how to conduct war fighting. Tom, a very good evening to you. 20 Druze civilians massacred, and al-Nusra several times now is going out of its way to declare that this wasn't on purpose, that the people who did this will be held accountable. Why are they so concerned, Tom? It's just 20 more dead people.
Well, good evening, John. Well, the issue here is that the Nusra Front, as opposed to the Islamic State, its rival in the jihadist world, is very careful, very conscious about its image within the Syrian rebellion. They want to be perceived as sort of the guys who are basically fighting leading the fight against Assad and don't really have any sort of totalitarian dreams or aspirations, which of course they do. And they've been very careful to try and basically portray themselves as being somewhat moderate when it comes to in their dealings with religious minorities in particular. They say they don't want to overrun them. And the Druze are one of those religious minorities. Now, there's also a very practical thing going on here, which is that basically the Druze villages in Syria have not risen up either on Assad's side or against Assad before this incident. And so the Nusra Front is very conscious of that because they know that these villagers have not really created more problems for the rebels, the insurgents against Assad. And now with this massacre of 20 Druze civilians, they risk radicalizing parts of the Druze population.
This is the Idlib province where al-Nusra has been boasting of its successes. They captured the city of Idlib and they're driving on various villages in Idlib. They're using their coalition to do this. And so having now this controversy, does this weaken them in the province?
Well, it depends on how much of a controversy it continues to boil. If their statement and they hold the fighters that are responsible for this accountable and they sort of convince everybody that this was really not something that was done with permission of the chain of command and it was just the actions of rogue fighters, which is the way they're portraying it, then they can probably quell the controversy and sort of keep moving on. One of the things that they've released in their statement, one of the things they've said is that basically the remaining Druze villagers are all under their protection. They're going to make sure that nobody does this sort of thing to them. And so if they're successful in repositioning themselves that way, pivoting themselves that way, then they can make the controversy go away. Giuliani's
quoted in your piece, Tom, "At this time we do not fight those who do not fight us." That's the heart of the dispute with the Islamic State, isn't it? The Islamic State kills everyone if they do not obey.
Yeah, it has to do with their jurisprudence in terms of how they wage jihad. So they actually have steps. Al-Qaeda has steps that they see in terms of what phase they are in terms of waging jihad. And at this point, they believe they have to remove the tyrant that is Assad before they can actually start really fully implementing an Islamic State and ruling over others. Whereas the Islamic State doesn't care about any of that. They come in and say, we're the caliphate, we're here, we're now, and we're just going to have a go of it. And we're going to rule according to our law while we're fighting everybody. And so it's two very different models for waging jihad and trying to accomplish the same thing.
Giuliani is the Syrian commander of the al-Nusra Front, which is in a coalition with other reflag all the time organizations with many names. But that's the al-Qaeda version in Syria. The Islamic State in Iraq is also in eastern Syria. When we come back, we'll turn to more war fighting in Iraq and how the Shia militia are doing against the Islamic State. Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, they keep the Long War Journal. I'm John Batchelor, Bill Roggio, and Tom Joscelyn, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We're doing war fighting now. This isn't the politics of campaigning for the presidency. This is the gritty reporting necessary to understand this vast landscape, in particular the Iraq Civil War, where we will begin with Mr. Roggio. And then we're not even going to move next door to the Syrian Civil War. We were just speaking of that with Nusra. We're going all the way to Libya. An important detail here as we go forward in this political year. Libya is an American problem. America participated in the coalition that took apart the governance that was holding Libya stable. Since then, it has been very difficult to generalize about Libya because it's divided into provinces and their tribes within it. We will report tonight of what we know a particularly threatening part of Libya. This is Cyrenaica province along the border in a city called Derna. But we begin now with the same city we spoke of earlier, the massive refinery at Baji. This is Iraq, and the Iraqi army would be what would be engaged with the Islamic State, except for the Shia militia. The Shiite militias are the Iraqi army more than not these days. Bill, the fighting in Baji, it is very difficult to characterize other than Stalingrad. This is urban fighting, very gritty stuff. You have photographs showing that the whole battlefield is spread out over many square miles. The Shia militia, are they now the Iraqi army? Do they do the bidding that ordinarily would be turned over to the Iraqi army?
Yes, that's pretty much correct. I mean, you're watching these militias operate artillery pieces, U.S. howitzers, Russian multiple-launch rocket systems. I've seen them operate tanks, U.S. Humvees, Iranian military vehicles, because they're all most of these militias are supported by Iran. These are militias, by the way, that the U.S. fought and the coalition fought before leaving Iraq in December 2008, or 2011, I'm sorry. And the U.S. never reconciled with these groups, and these groups really never reconciled with the Iraqi government. Groups like the League of the Righteous, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi Army, which is now called the Sarai al-Salam, or Peace Brigade, Hezbollah Brigades, which is actually designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And then other groups have sprung up, and they're all these groups are led by U.S.-listed, specially designated global terrorists, and the operations chief, and they're all organized under what's called the Popular Mobilization Committee. And this Popular Mobilization Committee, it's directed by a guy named Mohandas, who the U.S. designated as listed as a specially designated global terrorist. And this guy has he's described as an advisor to Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of Quds Force. So they are operating now as the primary strike force for the Iraqi government. And as I just laid out, you can see they're all bad actors. They're hostile to the U.S. The peace brigades and this group called Harkat al-Shahada threaten the United States. And they're the most effective militias. They're the ones that are going toe-to-toe with the Islamic State. They're the ones that help drive the Islamic State underground into Crete and liberated areas like Jurf al-Shakr and Amrili. When the Iraqi government and military itself has not liberated a single area. These militias have been involved.
What can we say about the airstrikes that the U.S. is launching? Are we coordinating with the Shiite militia at Baji?
I don't know that the U.S. is directly coordinating with the militias. But the net effect of what the U.S. is doing, and I doubt it. I think there's, from talking to U.S. Officers and intelligence officials in the military, I get the sense that nobody wants to work with them and they won't work with them. However, what we're doing is, in effect, helping them. Every time they target the Islamic State and the militias advance, the U.S. is advancing the causes of these militias in Iran.
3 airstrikes taken place in Baji within the last 24 hours. This is after you filed on June 10th. So we can presume, though it is 5 days later, the airstrikes are still available to support the Shiite militia.
Yeah, that's correct. And by the way, top U.S. military leaders, and as well as General John Allen, they've made claims, we're not supporting the militias. We're only supporting the groups that are sanctioned by the Iraqi government, which is the Popular Mobilization Committee, which, again, I just laid out as basically a front for the Shia militia.
It's Shia militia.
By Iran. Right. So, and these attacks are ongoing, and they're doing it under the cover. The U.S. government is doing it under the cover of supporting the Popular Mobilization Committee. To me, this is just desperation by the U.S. to show success in any way against the Islamic State inside Iraq.
Libya, Derna, in Cyrenaica province. Tom, the fighting there between two forces that are pitched against each other in Syria and now pitched against each other in Libya. Al-Qaeda controlling Derna and the Islamic State advancing on Derna. How did the battle come out?
Well, John, this is very interesting. Last year there were some press reports, a fair number of press reports actually, saying that the Islamic State's new province in Libya had taken over the city of Derna, and we were among the few people who said that wasn't true, that in fact Al-Qaeda has groups that are entrenched in Derna, and that the Islamic State's upstart presence, while significant and important, they clearly did not have control of the city. What happened is last week the Islamic State decided to have a go of it finally and decided to try and knock off 2 veteran jihadists, one of whom spent 16 years waging jihad in Afghanistan and elsewhere. They killed him in an attack at his home. This set off a major round of fighting where these groups, a couple different groups, one in particular called the Mujahideen Shura Council in Derna, not exactly a sexy name, not something that's going to get a lot of big Western attention until this happened. Basically, they decided to go after the Islamic State and make them pay for this. And I think that at this point, there's a lot of evidence that shows, in fact, the Islamic State really lost these battles, really got their tail kicked here. In fact, I've been told by some of my good sources that the Islamic State's real chieftain in the area was captured by this Mujahideen Shura Council in Derna, which is really an al-Qaeda front, and was basically made to walk through the town of Derna until he was finally hung. So they basically made an example of him in Derna to say, you're not in control of the city, you're not going to beat us, we're on top. And I think this speaks to a real big problem, a broader problem in the reporting. Everybody's Islamic State obsessed, really obsessed with ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State, whatever you want to call it. And they think that, basically this group has surpassed al-Qaeda. In some areas, particularly Iraq, they have, and until earlier this year in Syria they had, although al-Qaeda's made a big comeback there. But elsewhere, it's not the case that they've surpassed al-Qaeda. As we can see in Derna, for example, this was a city they supposedly controlled, and they didn't. Al-Qaeda actually very quickly dismantled their operations. And I think that's a big warning sign for anybody, taking in press coverage or covering this stuff or examining it, that, in fact, Islamic State's very good at propaganda, too good at propaganda almost, where they're actually leading news stories.
Tom, just a detail here, we have 15 seconds. Is this al-Qaeda in Derna, is this related to the Ansar al-Sharia that we've spoken over these last years?
You're absolutely right, John. In fact, one of the groups in the Mujahideen Shura Council in Derna is Ansar al-Sharia. They're a component part of the Shura Council there.
You'll see that name come up as we continue to investigate the Benghazi tragedy of 2012. Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, they keep the Long War Journal. The war fighting is intense and extremely, extremely violent. I'm John Batchelor.